My first encounter with Metal Gear Solid was in 2001 or 2002 when my father, brothers, and I encountered the game through a PlayStation 1 demo disc. My father was blown away by the way the Genome soldiers would follow Snake's footprints or hear him splash in puddles or knock on walls. In addition to that, Kojima's approach to cinematic design in MGS's cutscenes alongside top-of-the-line voice acting, at least for the time, solidified Solid Snake's third outing as one of the best games on the PS1 for my brothers and I. Although I would later learn in life that my dad didn't care for the game as much as we did. I was born in '95, which was a great time for growing up as a gamer. I was exposed to the later era of the SNES at the age of 3, making Mega Man X the first game I ever played. The PS1 carried me into the early polygonal era when I was 6, and the PS2 dominated my childhood until I was 16. Every handful of years I was exposed to a major jump in graphical quality, so much so that games like Final Fantasy VII looked dated by the time I played Final Fantasy VIII. Games that, for me, were separated only by a handful of months since I got all my games pre-owned growing up. There was a snobbish pushback against early 3D at the later end of the PS1's life and at the birth of the PS2, and that continued through the rest of the 2000s, 2010s, and it is only now, in the 2020s, that nostalgia and a retroactive appreciation for this era of art design has begun to be whispered here and there by gaming content creators, and today I add my voice to that sentiment. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and in this Rayl Deal review, I'll be retrospectively looking at Metal Gear Solid in terms of its early polygonal graphics, expression of late 90s gaming trends, porting to modern consoles, and value as a couch co-op experience. Join me on this exploration of the past through a modern lens, and by the end of this video, I'll explain why Metal Gear Solid on PS5 makes me want more PS1 ports on modern hardware. Do you all remember that time during the PS1's life cycle where nearly every single game's menu was filled with 3D items? The player would scroll through to pick what part of the menu they wanted. Sound options would be represented with a Walkman or some type of headset. Healing items would show up as some kind of health kit, and the save option was a giant PS1 memory card. Some games like Final Fantasy VII or Resident Evil didn't do this, but that told the player that they were playing a game with pre-rendered backgrounds. Games like Silent Hill, Ape Escape, and Tomb Raider flexed their 3D graphics in this menu way, and when the PS1's time had passed and the PS2 took over, this trend with games essentially stopped, only existing in the odd title or two. 3D just wasn't new by the end of the 90s, so there wasn't a need to render menu objects like that. And Metal Gear Solid shows that. It was released in 1998, and even though the PlayStation was only 4 years old at that point, its days were already numbered by the time 98 was over. Gaming generations weren't like they are in modern gaming back then. Each generation of hardware brought with it massive changes in graphical quality, performance, and gameplay design possibilities. The NES brought 8-bit game performance into the home. The Sega Genesis and SNES doubled the scope for games by providing 16-bit game design. The PS1 and N64 made 3D worlds possible. The PS2, Xbox, and GameCube pushed more polygons into every game, and the PS3 and 360 made HD possible. After the 7th generation faded though, the PS4 and Xbox One provided mostly minimal improvements to graphics, and the real thing that generation brought to the table was the ability to render more complex color palettes and polygons quickly, making wider open worlds and more dynamic movement possible. But with the 9th generation, not much has changed. Graphics are a bit better now, but we're at the point where graphics don't need to be much better than they are, and instead frame rate and limited loading appear to be the mainstays of this generation. In a lot of ways, Metal Gear Solid feels like a modern indie game with art direction reminiscent of the PS1, and that's the lens I viewed it through on my first complete playthrough of the game for this video. I had watched my brother and dad play the game when I was younger, and while in college I played a few hours myself, but I never personally finished it. In fact, I played so little, I've only ever made it to just past the tank boss fight near the beginning of the game. I'm not alone in seeing the value of early polygonal art styles in newer games, as Bloodborne PSX, Nightmare Kart, and Crow Country demonstrates. With the distance of time, early 3D in the modern day is a choice rather than a limitation, which is why I think this is. To say that people still talk about games from that era, whether it be Metal Gear Solid or Banjo-Kazooie, is an understatement. And something I love about this era of graphics is the way abstraction still exists within this art style. Consider the modern, big-budget video game where the designers don't have to create creative solutions to graphical restrictions. Nothing is ever left up to the imagination in these modern games, and for me, imagination has always been an important part of the game playing experience. I love video games because of their interactive nature, their synthesis of writing, cinematography, and enjoyer integration. Abstraction is what allows the players to express themselves through their interpretation of the gaming text, much in the same way linguistic limitations in poetry creates more opportunities for personal philosophizing and prophetic psychosis. Hardware restrictions create software art that doesn't have competition in terms of the integration of players' interpretive thoughts, leading to this budding indie revolution in the modern era. Metal Gear Solid dominates this period of gaming history that branches the gap between early polygonal gaming tropes and elimination of abstraction during the PS2 era, but because of its place within gaming history, it was beholden to gameplay trends in the 90s. Metal Gear Solid is one of the most creatively designed games in terms of its gameplay mechanics from the 90s. The stealth action genre essentially didn't exist before it, and because of how popular MGS was, games like Splinter Cell would come out a few years later. Stealth as a whole was a brand new push in gaming at the time, as shown by 4 stealth sections in games like Siphon Filter and its sequel. In fact, during the time period from 1993 to 2004, more gaming genres come into existence than any other 12-year span in gaming history. And this genre explosion was created by the massive increase in hardware every handful of years. In 1992, the survival horror genre would be born by the release of Alone in the Dark. However, the release of the original Resident Evil trilogy is what catapulted the genre into the main gaming discourse. JRPGs were a mainstay since the release of the original Dragon Quest in the 80s, but games at the end of the 90s started to play around with the gameplay formula in that genre, as shown with games like Parasite Eve. So when Metal Gear Solid released as essentially a 3D remake of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, it's not surprising that it was heralded as the creation of the stealth action genre. Now I know Metal Gear Solid is a narrative continuation of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, but several puzzles and gameplay scenarios come directly from that game, such as following the female soldier into the woman's restroom for a private conversation. The added third dimension provided new ways of looking at all these scenarios. When every gaming studio focused on trying to make the best game, because that was the only way to make money at the time, creatives like Kojima existed in the perfect era of gaming development, when crazy new design ideas quite often coincided with profit. Rather than being purely derivative, continuations of new gaming genres always sought to innovate upon the formula rather than simply trying to copy what came before. Warcraft turned the gameplay of Dune 2 into a new gaming genre, the real-time strategy game, otherwise known as RTS. Command & Conquer followed, innovating upon the formula while also matching cultural trends in the 90s, and after them, Age of Empires took the genre in a different direction. This is why, even though Metal Gear Solid is a derivative of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, it derives its game design in such a way that it is also innovative. Creative derivation is why games in the 90s were so good. They would take something that was familiar and shift it slightly enough to make it new again. And this is what modern games lack. They seek to iterate without expansion, and the reason for that is the insane costs of games now. Back in the 90s, it was easier for creatives to make creative decisions because the risk of investing in a new idea was so low. Companies were more willing to bank on a new idea. This is not the case anymore, which is why games from the PSX era aren't likely to ever come out again. Games like Devil May Cry coming out of the development of Resident Evil 4 were only possible because of creative derivation deconstructing old ideas of gaming design and reframing them into new genres or expansions of old genres. This game design trend is what made Metal Gear Solid possible, and I think we all need to look at the past to figure out the best way to move forward within the gaming space, much in the same way we as a species have always done. When making something new, sometimes looking to the past is the only way to illuminate the path forward, much in the same way Kojima did by moving into the 3D era by reframing his older work from a new perspective. And to this end, with the goal of improving modern gaming, I want more PS1 ports on modern hardware, please. At the time of its release as a part of the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1, there were complaints from some reviewers regarding the look of the first Metal Gear Solid as its graphics weren't enhanced in any degree for the re-release. When I heard this complaint, I actually wanted the collection more because that's exactly what I want. The path for a better gaming industry is a reverence for its past. I want PS1 ports that are as accurate to their original version as possible, with little to no variations. PlayStation has been okay at this over the past 10 years, with the way they sold emulated versions of a wide catalog of PS1 classics and masterpieces, and over the course of the past few years, they have steadily been adding these old games to the PS5's catalog. The pace at which they add them is a slow-going process, but any win for game preservation is a win I'll take to the bank. I gained sentience in the late 90s and grew up in the early 2000s, making that era of game design one of my favorites. So not only do I want PS1 ports for the benefit of gaming history, but I also want them so that I can play new, old games that are new to me, not to mention the fact that some of the best games ever made aren't available on modern hardware, such as Final Fantasy Tactics and its sequels. Playing through Metal Gear Solid for essentially the first time for this video has been a great experience because of my wide knowledge of games. Seeing the root of game design and trends through an older text makes me appreciate not only the older gaming text itself, but also its offsprings, and I plan to play Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater to see Kojima's creative ideas shift over time. Games from the NES, SNES, and PS1 era were designed with communities in mind. Game developers had to make games that were fun or thought-provoking because word-of-mouth advertising was still important at the time, and I don't mean modern forms of word-of-mouth advertising like streaming. Game developers wanted the players of their games to talk to each other, to talk about how good the game is, so that people who didn't catch the commercial on TV or in a random magazine would still go out of their way to find and play the game. This is part of why 1993's Doom and the original Resident Evil were so successful after all. Games had to stick with players in ways that would make the player not only talk about how good the game is, but also why the game is good. And the why is what sold the games. In this way, games from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were designed under the provision that players would talk about the games with their friends or have their friends over to play the game together. This is where the single-player co-op experience was born, and these games were designed in a way that made them fun to play with someone sitting right next to the primary player. This is how my brothers, dad, and I experienced most of the games we played back in the day. My dad didn't view gaming as a babysitter. He didn't sit us in front of the TV and then leave us be. He would participate in the game-playing experience, participating in the crafting of theories or solving of the puzzles and mysteries in the game. As a family, my brother's dad and I figured out the solution to the two most famous Metal Gear Solid puzzles, the back of the CD case bit and the Psycho Mantis boss fight, guideless because games in the 90s were designed to be solved without Google, as Google didn't exist yet and the internet was in its infancy. Bad games from this era made puzzles that were too hard to be solved with logic, and that's why those games are forgotten to this day. But the best games, the ones made with a great guiding hand, were solvable without guides, even if they seem impossible from a modern gamer's perspective. These Metal Gear Solid puzzles took hours and weekends to solve, but as a family, we all got smarter and achieved a higher sense of accomplishment by solving these seemingly impossible puzzles on our own. And gaming has lost this element of game playing because of the overproliferation of information through the internet. I miss being stumped on games. I miss needing to take weeks to figure my way through an issue with a game, which is why games by From Software are so good. They make games that are on the same level as games from the 90s, which is why the final boss in Sekiro took me several weeks to best, guideless. But what I miss more than that are the games of yesteryear that were designed with a tighter scope in mind, so that they could be enjoyed by a small group of in-person people playing through the experience together. And for this playthrough of Metal Gear Solid, I recreated that experience by inviting two of my friends, John and Jeremy, to join me on this Metal Gear Solid journey. At this point in YouTube's lifetime, Metal Gear Solid has been covered to death. However, one aspect of the game that has never been covered in a review is how fun the game is to play as a couch co-op experience. Most people only call a game couch co-op if it has multiplayer, but that is a limited way of looking at couch co-op. Every single-player game can be a couch co-op experience, although non-open world games make for the best community gaming experiences. Certain aspects of Metal Gear Solid stand out more after this playthrough of the game because of the commentary of my friends while playing. For example, being caught while sneaking around might have been frustrating on my own or otherwise unremarkable, but while playing and talking to my friends, an early part of MGS stands out as one of my favorite parts of the entire playthrough. This is what happened. I wonder, so in MGS2 you could crawl under the tank. Ah, you can in this one too, okay.
You don't get your radar.
You don't. You have to listen. Because I'm just trying to get used to the controls. Because it does play like a PS1 game. Oh! Ah! It's okay.
Right under the tank! He'll never find me there.
They didn't see me. They didn't see me! You imagine just being a guy on soldier duty, like guard duty, and some guy crawls out under a tank right in front of you.
And they were just like, oh, well, I guess he's gone.
Huh, it must have been a mouse.
Yeah, it's a fucking goddamn it.
Oh my god, it happened again! It happened again! And this type of thing happened again after Decoy Octopus died to Fox Die.
Snacking underneath the bed while this guy lays dead. Mmm, yummy.
Pound, pound.
Other parts of the game that are legitimately frustrating, like the button mashing torture scene, were made better as my friends and I got frustrated together dealing with it. We ended up passing the controller around to give ourselves time to rest individually so that we could actually pull this off. Button mashing has always been one of my most hated gameplay mechanics, and this one moment of Metal Gear Solid is why I don't think I'll be coming back to this game on my own ever again. I know you're able to bypass this section completely, however, it just isn't cool that one of the endings of the game is locked behind this mechanic. After this, my friends and I concocted an unorthodox way of fighting Sniper Wolf by shooting her with a bunch of Nikita missiles from complete safety outside of her range. I came up with this idea on a whim, but I don't think it would be so memorable if my friends weren't there to laugh alongside me. Unfortunately, my audio didn't work out while recording the rest of our playthrough, otherwise I'd include the audio here because it was definitely a fun time. And finally, fighting Liquid atop Metal Gear provided this playthrough with the added benefit of a great conversation regarding beat-em-ups and how my love of that genre provided me with the transferable skills to make this part of the game trivial. And these 4 moments are only a part of what made this playthrough such a fun time. My friends and I plan to play through a lot of older games together because of how great this experience was. And John and I will have already completed our Mega Man X challenge run by the time this video comes out. Games need this couch co-op experience back. We as gamers need these types of social interactions back. Streaming and watching streams is a shadow facsimile of this aspect of yesteryear gaming that has disappeared as we've gotten older and as the convenience of the internet promotes our isolation over our interactions. I started this YouTube channel as a way of finding other gamers to talk to during the work week when I'm not able to be around my IRL friends because somehow we've created a world that is framed around isolation, an isolation that is shrouded by social media and online gaming. But that is a deeper topic for a different time. How about we finish off this Rayl Deal review of Metal Gear Solid right now? At the end of each of my reviews, I answer the question of whether the game I'm reviewing will end up on my top 100 for the decade of the game's release. And in the terms of the 90s list, Metal Gear Solid has been on that list for a long time. However, this playthrough of the game did make it drop a few places. I classify games on my top 100 lists with color, as red or blue. A red game is one that is likely to remain on the list when I finish my backlog for that decade, and a blue game is one that is on the chopping block and likely to not make the final list. Metal Gear Solid has been in the blue category ever since I started classifying games that way, and this playthrough isn't going to change that. I love this game. The game wouldn't be on my top 100 at all if I didn't, and playing this game for the first time all the way through has me interested in taking a second look at some of my favorite games from the 90s, such as the first 3 Tomb Raider games, and trying out other games from the 90s I never had the chance to, such as Valkyrie Profile. Let me know in the comments below if you want to hear my thoughts on these games at some point in the future, and I'd love some more PS1 game recommendations too. And that's the video, my guys. What do you think of my thoughts on Metal Gear Solid? Let me know in the comment section below, and while you're there, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have a moment right now, you may like one of my other videos on the screen. Regardless of what you choose to do, have an awesome day, gamers.